You're listening to Frontier Matters, the podcast from 1914 Reader. Join us as we dive into bold conversations on growth and change in the frontier economies of the world.
Our guest today is an analyst and writer who came to wider renown as a public intellectual through his annual dispatches from China, written while he was living in the country and trying to make sense of it as a working system. His latest book, Breakneck, is in many ways a conversation between East and West, between China's self-image as a high-capacity builder civilization and the United States' self-image as a rules-bound, loyally society, and between the temptation of speed and the virtues of constraint. It's a book that invites comparison and a certain amount of discomfort. But on today's episode, we want to attempt to barge in on that conversation between East and West to ask what an engineering state is in the longer developmental state tradition, to ask what distinguishes China's model from the Soviet experiment, and what its long-run failure modes might be, to interrogate the story that China tells abroad through infrastructure, and crucially, to explore what democratic societies can learn without borrowing the coercive paths by accident. Dan Wang, welcome to Frontier Matters.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, I'm going to start off with a question I really want to get off my chest. I apologize in advance if it's a bit long and winding. Okay, so it's something you mentioned in your latest letter. As you know, here in the UK, we've been on a 20-year saga to build a third runway at Heathrow Airport. A huge part of the delay is that it will require flattening several nearby villages, right? And when you read and listen to some of the residents' arguments, people who live around the parts that need to make way for the runway, they say things like, "Oh, you can't do this. My village was mentioned in the Domesday Book, which goes back 1,000 years or something." So the implication of that is that there's a historic nature, which makes it non-negotiable, an impossible barrier, basically. Now, I read a fair bit about China. And what I consistently see are complaints about land being taken, often with what people feel is inadequate compensation. But I don't think I've ever come across an argument or somebody in China saying, "Oh, you can't take this land for a high-speed rail line or a new airport because it's been in my family since the Song dynasty." The grounds for objection seem fundamentally different, right? So here in the West, I know, especially here in the UK and even the rest of the West, that politicians love nothing more than to wear hard hats or high-vis jackets and go cut a ribbon on a shiny new infrastructure. But when it comes to actually building, it seems like it's the people who are the biggest barrier. They're armed with arguments about heritage, history, and all that sort of thing. So here's my question. Is there something to be said for the idea that China's ability to build infrastructure so quickly isn't just about top-down efficiency, but also about a different societal relationship with the past, right? Is the biggest constraint in the West, not capital or technology, but the fact that we have elevated heritage into an absolute barrier, whereas in China, provided the composition is fair and justice is done, such claims simply don't carry the same weight. So sorry, a long-winded one. But
here's something similar between China and the UK. Both countries have a lot of history. And the Chinese would say that arguably they have a little bit more history and various books that people can consult. But I think that there is a difference between China and the UK, which is that the UK does value property rights in a much more serious way, starting with these rights of individual liberties that are very much enshrined in the British consciousness. Whereas at the moment, China's sense of property rights has been undeveloped in part because it suffered through a few decades of communism in which the state is very explicitly, this is one of the first things that nobody really can own a lot of pretty crucial resources. That is one of these central tenets of communism. And China was also much poorer, in which people simply weren't able to resist as much of the land grab by the government as they might have liked. And I think that is starting to change, in which people are getting richer, in which people are asserting their claims sometimes of heritage against the state, or more often just saying things like they don't want a trash incinerator right in their neighborhood, right in their backyard, in a recognizably British or Californian complaint. So I think that is also partly changing, and I think that is changing for the good, because if we say that the system might work fine if justice was if it is fair and compensation is great, well, maybe in most cases that has been true for China, but we cannot guarantee that for every case. And the problem with China is that because the state has so much discretion, it is really, really difficult to really establish a sense that everybody feels that they have been treated very well. But I think that there is something too that works with China, and maybe I would throw the U.S. into this in a way that doesn't really work very well in the UK or the rest of continental Europe, in which people seem to be much more bound by rules of the past rather than thinking about the needs of the future. So I've recently been speaking to a CEO who told me that, essentially in this kind of stylized example, but this really happened to him. On a Friday afternoon, he went to go see some of his staff in the UK to say, hey, this customer really needs this product. Generally, we try to do this in 3 days, but could we really hustle and try to do this in the next afternoon? And essentially, the staff read him the riot act and said, well, here are all the working rules, and there is no possible way that this could comply with all of our rules. Whereas he did essentially the same exercise with his American operations, and the American workers essentially said, well, here are some trade-offs, but we're able to get this done because we realize the business case here. And so there is something about the UK as well as continental Europe in which people are bound up by these conceptions of dead rules, in which, if you violate this, then you are violating, quote, the rule of law, or, you're violating something deeply important. And sometimes this is important, but sometimes we need to be a little bit thinking about, what do people need and want, and how do we deliver these to people, like potentially a third runway at Heathrow?
Hmm. I mean, coming to your book, Breakneck, which is great, by the way, you memorably described China as an engineering state, which has now made it into the cultural zeitgeist in discussing about the East and West generally. How do you see that concept fitting into the broader history of developmental states, like Japan in the past, Korea, even moments in US history where infrastructure, industrial policy, and export-led growth were pursued as national projects? Would you say the engineering state is simply the latest form of the developmental state, or is it something categorically different in your conception?
I think that China is more a continuation than any radical break. And I think that is, I think that there is no rich country today that was not at some point an engineering state, that they had to build, they got rich after building homes for its people, infrastructure, as well as some degree of manufactured products. It is really difficult to name well-off countries that have managed to skip building a lot of infrastructure, for example. Perhaps something like Costa Rica, which is very tourist-driven, fits that bill, but I'm not sure that even that is a strong case. And I think what distinguishes China, the reason that I think it is more of an engineering state than elsewhere, is that, first of all, I think that there is continuation between other East Asian states. So especially Japan, Korea, Taiwan, they have all built incredible amounts of infrastructure in ways that look even quite a lot like what the Chinese have built. The Americans, the British, Europeans have also built quite a lot in an earlier century. And I think what China has that the other East Asian states don't have as much is this Leninist heritage, which it learned very substantially from the Soviet Union, in which they built heavy industry, concrete, chemical plants, steel, etc., in a much more intensive way than I think the Japanese were able to build. The Japanese learned some restraint, and they also had a financial crisis that made them unable to build quite a lot past the 1990s. So I think China is kind of an East Asian development state, kind of a classic development state that managed to get rich. But what is also really important is this Leninist Soviet heritage in which it was much more interested in pursuing heavy industry than the more export-oriented light industry specialists of, let's say, Korea and Taiwan.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's the subject of Frank Dakota's new book in terms of the Soviet heritage of the Chinese Communist Party. But okay, so apart from that, is there anything else in the China's success that you might call unique conditions that's made it successful versus, say, lessons that other people can realistically adopt? So if say China is a development state, just as we've been talking about, are there things that are just so unique to China that can't travel elsewhere?
I think that unlike the Soviet Union, China built a functioning economy. That was something that the Soviets never quite achieved. Unlike Japan, China has been very intent on catching technological waves of the future. And it has managed to stay at the forefront of a lot of technologies in which the Japanese could not. Unlike Britain, China is able to build highways as well as runways for airports, as well as high-speed rail as well. So, I think that, it has all of these strengths against all of these other failing economies. So, and there's also all sorts of things that I think is pretty unique to the Communist Party, that it is highly technocratic, reasonably meritocratic, at least in the past, that it has a lot of discretion over the economy, that sometimes is good, that sometimes is bad. But, there is this pretty sophisticated planning apparatus that precedes the communist era, that there was quite a lot of control over the economy by the mandarins of the court as well. But, you have all of these intermixed with a fairly entrepreneurial, dynamic culture, especially in the East as well as the South. Southern parts of China, and you have all of these things mixed together. That and you have 1.4 billion people. It's just a giant population where things that might not make sense for if you're a smaller country like South Korea, or to say nothing of Denmark, actually could be pulled off by the Chinese. And so when you add all of these things up together, they have been able to accomplish quite a lot, but still face still a lot of challenges too.
Mm. Do you think the US has lost its engineering state capacity, or is it just dormant? So my example of this is during the early days of COVID, America's response was heavily criticized, even by so many people in the Valley and so many analysts and scholars, relative to how China responded. But then we saw with Operation Warp Speed and so many other things that the US was able to do subsequently, I guess when the political consensus reached a tipping point, that the US still has a lot of capacity to do big things when it wants to. And more importantly, is there a risk that America's slowdown and dysfunctions are just misdiagnosed? It is a very rich country, growing slowly but steadily, but also a frontier economy that has to grow through new innovations and not just copying. I recall the economist Dietrich Vollrath has argued that what many analysts argue as American slowdown is just the sign of an economy that is fully grown. What do you think?
I think that the U.S. engineering capacity is not dead. It's also not just napping, but I think that there is, something maybe comatose. It's a coma that they are able to wake up from every so often. And so first, I think it is worth acknowledging American strengths. So Operation Warp Speed was definitely an amazing achievement, development of mRNAs, which the Europeans were also able to match, but I think the Americans did it better. That there is a lot of biotech innovation that over the past 30 years, maybe more like 20 years, fracking has also been an enormous asset for the American energy ecosystem, on top of the creation of large language models, as well as these trillion-dollar companies on the West Coast. So all of these things are very much real American strengths. And what is surprising, I think, to me about the US is that it cannot do the basics very well. It cannot build homes for people. It cannot have trains that run adequately. Its subway system is fairly broken. And, there's all sorts of very serious deficiencies in the US. Its manufacturing base has very substantially rusted. What good are these trillion-dollar software companies when the US, in the early days of COVID, struggled to make masks and cotton swabs? And so I think, there is something very strange and paradoxical with the US economy, which they are able to make this super sophisticated stuff. And Elon Musk is able to launch a lot of these rockets. But just the spending that they have to undertake, the scale of spending, I'm speaking to you from Silicon Valley, where San Francisco spends about as much in its annual budget as the city of Paris, which is several times larger. And, the outcomes are just so much worse. So, there's definitely at least something very deeply broken about America. And, the question is whether the things that go very well are not mere baubles, which are pretty shining and glittery, but are they, do they represent something bigger and better? And can America do the basics that people actually need?
So I'm going to take it back a bit now to something you already alluded to about how China has embedded capitalist incentives on markets in its economy, which distinguishes it from the Soviet Union. Now, in your view, what are the risks that remain for China's engineering state? From the Soviet model, right? And what is China's integration of markets and incentives? Is that enough to prevent a Soviet-style stagnation or collapse, or how does China balance flexibility with a single-minded pursuit of strategic metrics? So, what blind spots do you think mirror the Soviet Union's mistakes?
There are so many. So first of all, I think with the central planning tendencies of China, this fluctuates back and forth. But if the Communist Party is very intent on pursuing central planning harder than it has, then this is probably the biggest risk to the Chinese economy, that they smack around tech entrepreneurs, they try to have this controlled demolition of the property sector, and they manage to get a lot of things wrong. Now, right now, it doesn't seem like the worst case scenario is manifesting in terms of their control tendencies. But the problem with these, I think, Leninist systems is that it is never very stable, that there is always going to be some sense that they need to do more than they ought to. And my view is that China can really win quite a lot if the leaders could just learn to do less. But that's not what Leninists, that's not why Leninists get out of bed every day. They want to do more. And so, could this central planning tendency suffuse and snuff out a lot of the commercial instincts? That is one of these big risks. Speaking of other risks, China today, the Communist Party today, looks a little bit more like the Soviet Union in terms of a gerontocracy, in which the party itself is aging. They're not replenishing the ranks, not just within the top of the Politburo or the Central Committee, but also the provincial party secretaries and sometimes the municipal party secretaries are themselves getting older as well. I think that's not a really terrific sign for the health of the vitality of the system. And then when you pile on these other risks that China faces, demography is something that we can all see that right now the demographic decline is not very severe, but in 20 years it really will be. And that the property sector is becoming a drag. Chinese cities are not very delivering economic results for young people. Young people can't find a job or find a spouse. And so there's a lot of gloom and unhappiness there. Doesn't mean that they are going to fully fail, but I think the pessimistic case on China is also quite easy to identify.
Do you think so? I mean, what's your take on politics in general? So, I mean, every time, a general goes missing in China, there are breathless articles about Xi Jinping. We get this organogram again where another red X on a general. Obviously this to me is politics, but what's your take? I mean, how high or low do you rate that as a risk to China's future?
Somewhat substantial risk, with a caveat that none of us ever have any idea what is going on in Beijing. And really, there's very few people, there's very few elites in Beijing who have any sense of what the Politburo might do. And I suspect that much of the Politburo is very uncertain about their own fates. It is pretty miserable being a Politburo member. No two of them may socialize on their own without the presence of a third Politburo member being there as well. And so, I think there are just all these deep uncertainties within the system. Does it mean that the system will collapse? Not necessarily, but it is also pretty unusual for any Leninist system to annihilate high command, which Xi Jinping has done over the last couple of years, in which of the members of the Central Military Commission, there's just him and the chief of discipline, which is like the Grand Inquisitor inside the system. And so, if there's just the Inquisition and then everyone else has disappeared, that doesn't feel like a system of health and vitality to me. And this is where risks get higher, even though it's really hard to tell what exactly might happen.
Hmm. So, I mean, I have a fairly long question, but I'll break it up in parts so that you can keep track. Unlike many early developmental states, I mean, we look at the relationship between Japan and Korea, and even Korea with Bangladesh. They were able to export know-how, but China's record abroad seems very mixed. Many have argued that the Belt and Road Initiative has failed to deliver sustained economic impact, and especially in Africa, Chinese infrastructure often underperforms compared to earlier eras of Western contractors. Do you view this as a failure of execution or local political economies, or a sign that China is more interested in projecting the image of state capacity than in building it abroad?
I think it is more interested in image, without ruling out that I think that there is that there may be something good there. I take your point that it does seem like a lot of the Chinese construction is worse than the German construction. But the question is whether the German construction is on offer and at what price point, and if the Chinese still build something there, is it better than whatever else above whatever else that they could expect? Now, I think the primary reason for the Chinese to have launched the Belt and Road Initiative is not really economic development of others. It's also not just protection of image. I think it is mostly because these state-owned enterprises needed to export their surplus somewhere, because China was in part running out of space to build some of their big projects. And so they really wanted to export their excess capacity. And as they did so, the Communist Party came up with this nice little branding term to say, well, this is now something called the Belt and Road. And so I think that this whole thing is, it's a quite complicated thing where there's no single motivation here, but everything sort of came out and shook out together. But I would probably agree with this case that the primary interest is not to economically develop and technologically develop others, just as it wasn't quite the primary interest of something even like the Marshall Plan from the US to develop others. Well, there was also this big effort to contain communism as well as other things. So there's always a mix of motivations there.
Yeah, I mean, your answer sort of touched on my follow-up, which, addresses overcapacity. But what is your general perception of BRI generally? Has it become a sunk cost project for the Chinese state? Of course, we know that it's not purely a development strategy. And could the reluctance or the inability to export know-how weaken its long-term influence?
I think my sense is that the Belt and Road is becoming more dormant, but the Chinese have kind of this rubric and the structure in place, and they'll never quite get rid of it. I think that the structure will be there. And I think one thing that the Communist Party is generally able to do is learn from some of its mistakes, as well as adjust tactically if it needs to. So they kind of have these big ambitions, and if they see that things are not going terribly well, then they are able to adjust. And if they have more money, they can throw more money into this. If they have less money, then they take money out of this. So I think that the program will always be there. And, if there's more backlash, then maybe they try to get smarter. And but they're always going to be able to point to this and say, we are doing more. Look at these, rail lines that we're building in Indonesia or Ethiopia, and look at these people taking them, even if people are not terribly pleased with them. But it's always going to be a diplomatic talking point that they can use against the Americans or the Europeans to say, well, at least we are doing something here.
So that's a good segue to my next question, which is just a kind of follow-on from that. I was going to ask, so to what extent do you think these Chinese engineering feats are meant not only for domestic development, but also to perpetuate a sort of contrast with American and Western quote-unquote dysfunction? Is the image of competence itself becoming a form of geopolitical competition? It probably is, but I'd like to hear your take on that.
I think that the Chinese are very self-conscious of their image. Paradoxically, that is also part of why their image is not so good, because they are too interested in control, and they cannot let creative flourishing of their own people help them out and bail out the bad image of the Communist Party. And I think they are very intent on being anti-US for quite a long time. That a lot of their starting point is the US is this evil bully that they're trying to keep China down, and they are really interested in making sure that other countries do not sign up to the American program to contain China in the way that the US managed pretty substantially to contain the Soviet Union. And so they are trying to build all sorts of trading relationships with other people, with other countries, really to try to make sure that U.S. isn't able to get them to sign on to cut off trading relations. And actually that's not being helped by a lot of the U.S. administration's policies today, because in some ways Trump is demonstrating that the U.S. is actually a pretty unreliable partner and a pretty big source of risk for the entire world.
Mm. Mm.
You haven't, You've talked a lot about semiconductors, manufacturing, so many other things, but I don't think I've ever heard you talk about electric vehicles. And the reason why is for a lot of people, especially in the third world, across Africa, this is the big thing that China is doing right now. What is driving a lot of China's image. So you have all these cheap electric vehicles. I mean, I live in the UK, but Toby and I, obviously, I'm originally from Nigeria, and it's probably one of the biggest conversations around in terms of, all these Chinese electric vehicles that are being exported a lot. I mean, what's your, just a general sense or take of it, both from a Chinese perspective and how you see this playing out over the next, medium to short to medium term?
China is making the best electric vehicles in the world now, period. So at the quality as well as the capabilities, as well as the price points, I think that the Chinese vehicles are unmatched. And the only question is whether different countries are able to adopt a lot of EVs because not everyone has built the electric grid infrastructure for that, but maybe they are. And then the extent to which that they accept Chinese vehicles. And there's a lot of back and forth on this. The U.S. has essentially put a full ban on electric vehicles from China because of data transmission issues. Europe has different policies here. The Canadians just traded about 50,000 Chinese EVs for access to Canadian canola. And when I read about, when I see headlines like that, I wonder who's the developing country and who's the developed country here when you're trading, EVs and their batteries for canola. So I think that this is definitely one of these big things, but I also feel like there's all sorts of concerns about Chinese producers, not just in EVs, but in all sorts of products overrunning domestic markets. So even a lot of countries that are supposedly pretty friendly towards China, like let's say Russia, Brazil, Malaysia, India, they have been putting up substantial trade barriers to China because they don't want to have their own producers overrun. And so this is kind of this complicated diplomatic tussle that will play out between excellent Chinese goods on the one hand, which are very pleasing to consumers, as well as some sort of, geopolitical concerns, as well as domestic industry concerns. That I think this is going to be an ongoing story for the next decade.
Mm, mm. My final question is something that personally sort of worries me, which is that over the last couple of years, we've seen Silicon Valley elites and tastemakers become enamored with China's high capacity image. So much so that many of them now see democracy as weak and that it has handicapped America's ability to compete with China for future technological capability or possible warfare. Should this be troubling? Would you say authoritarianism is the secret to China's recent success? What do you think, especially about the politics of this?
I think that if the rest of the world, especially Europe, the UK, and the US, are able to learn something from China's successes, which are real and substantial, and for them to be able to deliver better for their own citizens, I think that is highly positive. And I think that the first thing to acknowledge about much of Europe, UK, and the US is that a lot of it has not done very well for the last, call it 30 years, maybe call it even longer than that, in which they have not kept up with home construction, in which they have not kept up with infrastructure construction, that there's the manufacturing base in a lot of these countries has pretty substantially rusted. So, there has been quite a lot of failures. And when the Chinese are able to build many more homes, much more electrical power, invent the future as well through electric vehicles. We can have a debate about how much of this is authoritarian. Now, I believe that authoritarianism is not the magic key here, because there's all sorts of authoritarian powers who have not done this very well. There is a mix of planning as well as very fierce market competition in China. But I would I'm constantly telling American policymakers that the US has nothing to lose to acknowledge that China has actually done very, very well. And it's not all just cheating and stealing, that they have done a lot of capacity building, and that they need to the US needs to get substantially better at building much more for its people. And if viral videos on TikTok is the way for Americans to realize that there's a whole different and better world out there that Americans are no longer able to build, I think that's great.
I've got a couple more questions. So the first one is a short one. Is a quick. I think maintenance is a topic again, especially around in the West. Not just building new stuff, but actually getting the most out of the old stuff. So, China is obviously famous for building things quite fast, but maintenance is obviously is a different skill. Is the Chinese system as good? I don't have a sense of this. I haven't been to China in about 8 years, but is the system as good as maintaining as it is as building, or in your view?
No. I think that it's kind of incredible how many times you get a new shopping mall in China, and then as soon as you go in, like half the toilets don't really work properly. And there is just something which they don't value so much the finer aspects in a way that you would see, I think, in Europe or Japan, in which things work on average much, much better in terms of some of the softer, smaller, finer polishes. And I've been to I think that the government has these targets to build toilets in a lot of places and build better bathrooms. And I think that's all really good. But then they don't really have the staff to maintain them. And so, there's been situations in China in which they build these new bathrooms, but then they don't really have anyone to maintain them. And so actually they end up just being closed. So you've hit the target. You've hit the central planning target, but it doesn't really work well for its people. So I think I'm very open to the case that 30 years from now, maybe even 10 years from now, a lot of China's infrastructure will look like it has rusted pretty substantially. It doesn't look so good, but it's also possible that the engineering state decides to just tear these down and rebuild them again because they just want to keep building.
Finally, I want to come to your most recent letter, where you argue that winning the AI future isn't about a finish line model race so much as whether AI diffuses throughout the whole economy. Now, what's interesting is that China is now trying to codify that diffusion project at the state level. So last year, the State Council, they issued a paper called AI Plus, and opinions, which explicitly talk about pushing AI into everything from production and services to people's livelihoods, including, I think the memorable one was companionship style applications and AI that provides emotional comfort in areas like elderly care. Something similar to what I first heard from your former boss, Arthur Krober, where I think he called it informatization, where the CCP wants to put a new technology into everything, right? So like when they had the internet, put it in everything, or electricity, put it into everything. Now, using your engineering state lens, how should we read a document like that, or the CCP's intentions as stated in the document like that is as a developmental state blueprint for AI diffusion, or is it more just signaling? And if it is credible, what's the real binding constraint that determines whether that sort of thing works in practice? Is it power, compute, data, procurement, those sort of things?
I think that these documents are always signaling as well as some sort of policy intent. So, I think that if we take a look at some of these other documents, like most infamously Made in China 2025, where they had this broad goal to make China broadly self-sufficient in terms of 70% of technologies by the year 2025, these are targets that I take seriously, but not literally. And so I think that, it is part of a way to tell the rest of society, this is something that we want to do. And there will be kind of a planning apparatus to discipline the central government, as well as provincial governments, as well as local governments, so that they're all aware of this. And maybe they have some harder targets to hit. And I think, what is distinguishing China is that Silicon Valley is all about getting as much compute as possible and building these, very high-powered data centers with, hundreds of megawatts that are going to be in place. Whereas China, I think, is thinking much more about how to take these often open source models that are substantially cheaper to try to deliver things that people want. I tend to think that I'm much more deployment pilled than compute pilled, as kids here would say, and I think that it is just ultimately what we need to figure out is how do we make use of these sort of things rather than just inventing these things in a lab.
And as the way China has framed its AI diffusion policy, does it tell us something about how Beijing is trying to turn AI into a legitimacy project, not just an economic one? Is there some kind of, is it tying its legitimacy to this new frontier technology in some way?
I think that they value AI because they think that it might be economically important. They also have decided that they never want to lose a technological race, because part of the Communist Party's self-conception, along with older self-conceptions in China, is that the Qing dynasty was defeated by the British imperialists because the imperialists had technology and the Qing did not. And so they are very obsessed with making sure that they no longer miss any technologies. And this is, I think, something that distinguished them from Japan, which did not take informatization seriously enough. Yeah, and I think that they also have the sense that, if Silicon Valley is inventing a new form of thinking through this artificial brain, they don't want their own thinking to be hurt by Western values, especially Silicon Valley values, which frankly I think alienate most people, even in Silicon Valley, to say nothing of the United States, to say nothing of the rest of the West, to say nothing of the entire world. So I think that they are motivated politically, geopolitically, and economically, and in terms of their own domestic understanding of themselves, that they really want to make sure that they have a brain that is not affected by California thought.
What are you doing next?
I am trying to read some very long novels, and I think that some very long history books as well, because they bring me a lot of pleasure. And I am thinking very extensively about the future of U.S.-China competition, because I think that both of these countries are very powerful. Neither of them are going to implode, and the competition is going to be with us for years and decades, and we need to be smarter about this very big challenge.
I mean, is there another book coming? You can give us the tea.
I hope so.
Keep writing about them. I mean, you inspired me to finally read Bleak House last day. I quite enjoyed it, actually. So I thought that was quite good. But anyway, thank you very much, Dan. It's been a pleasure having you on, and we look forward to what you do next.
Thank you very much.